Chapter 15. Those first 2 days on the Carpathia were a blur. George mostly slept on a bed of blankets and pillows on the floor of the first-class lounge, but he sensed that Phoebe and Aunt Daisy never left his side. He sometimes heard Angel singing softly to him in Italian, his breath hot on George's cheek. He heard Aunt Daisy and Phoebe talking about Marco, whose feet were badly frozen, about the Carpathia's passengers who couldn't do enough for them all, about the hundreds and hundreds of people who didn't make it out of the water. Slowly, George felt stronger, and on the last night at sea, he was able to go out onto the deck with Phoebe. They sat on a bench, wrapped in a blanket. A stewardess came over and gave them each a mug of warm milk. Phoebe looked up at the sky as she warmed her hands on the mug. I finally saw the shooting star when I was on the lifeboat, she said. You can guess what I wished for. You can guess what I wished for. George reached for a hand. Yes, of course he knew. On the bench next to them sat two women. Both were crying. Probably they lost their husbands, or brothers, or fathers. There hadn't been enough wishing stars for everyone that night. Phoebe said that only about 700 of them made it out of the water. Phoebe leaned in close to George. Her coat smelled like rose water. A lady from the Carpathia had given to her. Have you wondered, she asked quietly, if maybe there really was a curse? At first, George didn't understand that Phoebe was talking about the mummy. With all that had happened, George hadn't thought about it, but now it hit him. How strange it was that the ship had collided with the iceberg at the exact moment the scar-faced man had opened the lid of Mr. Burrow's crate. I guess we'll never know, George said, but the next evening, as the Carpathia was closing in on New York Harbor, George and Phoebe overheard a skinny man with a beard speaking to an officer. Before the Titanic, I was stranded in Egypt, a place called Thebes, the man said. I explored a magnificent tomb of a royal family. Phoebe's eyes bugged out, and before George could stop her, she had marched over to the man. Excuse me, she said. Are you Mr. Burroughs? Yes, I am, the man replied. Phoebe took a big breath. Mr. Burroughs, she said. This might sound like a very strange question, but did you bring a mummy on board the Titanic? The man looked at Phoebe. A mummy? He said. Yes, she said. We heard it was a princess. Mr. Burroughs' eyes were tired and sad, but he smiled a little. My princess, he said. Yes. So there was a mummy, Phoebe exclaimed. No, child, she said. One should never take a mummy from a tomb. That is very bad luck. Phoebe was my princess was my cat. She passed away on my trip to Egypt. So I had her wrapped so I could bring her back with me. So the princess was the cat? Yes, he said sadly, the most beautiful cat that ever lived. 3 hours later, just after 9 o'clock, the Carpathia docked in New York City in a thunderstorm. There were thousands of people waiting on the pier, but the first person George saw as they walked down the gangplank was Papa. He rushed up to George and Phoebe, gathered them both, and brought them to him. and pulling them to him. All around them, people cried with happiness. Others just cried, their tears mixed with the pouring rain. They introduced Papa to Marco and Enzo, but there wasn't much time to talk. The train to Millerstown was leaving soon, and an ambulance was waiting to take Marco to the hospital. Luckily, George didn't have to say a real goodbye to Marco and Enzo. Aunt Daisy was staying in New York City to take care of Enzo until Marco's feet were healed, and then they would come with her for a visit to Millerstown. Seeing the way Marco and Aunt Daisy were looking at each other, George wondered if maybe Marco and Enzo would stay forever. George sure hoped so. As they rode to the train station, newsboys screamed from every street corner. We're all about it. Titanic survivors in New York. More than 1,500 people are dead. We're all about it. George covered his ears. He wanted to forget everything about the Titanic. He wanted to put it out of his mind forever. Chapter 16. But he couldn't forget. Even back on the farm, surrounded by friends from school and neighbors from town, he felt like he was still drifting on the dark ocean. And each day that went by, he felt himself drifting farther away. At night, when he got into bed, he'd see the faces of all those scared people on G deck. He'd seen the ships disappearing into the sea. He remembered the stabbing cold and the screams of hundreds of people crying for help. He didn't bother trying to fall asleep. He didn't bother trying to fall asleep. Each night after each night after Phoebe and Papa were in bed, he went outside in the woods. He was heading back to the house one night when he heard a noise through the bushes. Something was there. He could sense it. The panther? He took out his knife, finding the urge to run away, and peeled through the branch. George stared in shock. It was Papa. He was sitting on a large rock, looking up at the sky, smoking his pipe. He looked like he'd been there for some time. Papa turned. He didn't look especially surprised to see George. Sorry to give you a scare, he said. What are you doing here? George asked. Don't know, Papa said. Sometimes I just come here when I can't sleep. George couldn't believe it. How many nights had they both been out in the woods at the same time? Pa- Papa eased himself off the rock and began walking back towards the house. I'll take you up. I'll take you up to your bed. No, Papa, George said. I come to the woods too. Papa looked at him with a very slight smile. I know that, he said. Papa knew. What else did Papa know about George? What else didn't George know about Papa? He and his father looked at each other. Really looked. For the first time in a long time, in a long while. Maybe since Mama died. Suddenly, George started to cry. They took him by surprise. His tears, he couldn't stop. He cried for all those people who didn't make it out of the water. He cried because somehow he did. He cried because he knew that no matter how much time went by, a part of him would still be out in that ocean. He would never forget. Papa held George's hand and didn't say a word. And then he led George over to the boulder where they sat together under the stars. George stared up at the sky. Were those really the same stars that had burned so brightly above the black ocean that night? Was he really still the same boy? George George, who couldn't stay out of the trouble. George, who didn't try hard at school. George, who found the escape ladders. George, who pulled Margot to that lifeboat. Who didn't give up. They sat on the boulder for a long while, and as the sun started to peep over the trees, George told Papa about Mr. Andrews. He said that he thought one day I'd build a ship. Papa didn't laugh. He puffed on his pipe, looking thoughtful. How about we build one together? Papa said. A nice little boat for the pond. I've always wanted to do that. That's a good idea, George said. A great idea. We could start today, Papa said, standing up and holding out his hand. They walked back to the house together. The birds were singing softly, the chickens were squawking for breakfast, a breeze was whispering through the trees, and a voice seemed to sing to George very softly. Awake, awake, it's now daybreak, but don't forget your dreams. Papa looked out into the woods like he could hear it too.